Welcome to Echo of Crime YouTube channel. For years, Vicky White was viewed as the definition of professionalism inside the American correction system. She worked for the Lauderdale County Sheriff's Office in Alabama for nearly 2 decades, earning a reputation as a disciplined, reliable, and rule-focused officer. Colleagues trusted her judgment. Supervisors relied on her experience. In a profession built on control and procedure, she was seen as someone who followed the rules without question. As a senior corrections officer, Vicky White's responsibilities went far beyond basic supervision. She understood jail operations in detail, how inmate transfers worked, which paperwork was required, and where security gaps could exist. Her long service gave her authority and autonomy, allowing her to move through the facility with little scrutiny. In an environment where trust between staff is essential, her clean record meant that few ever questioned her decisions. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. She lived quietly, avoided attention, and maintained a low profile. There were no public signs of misconduct, no history of disciplinary action, and no indication that she posed any risk. This outward normalcy made the events that followed especially difficult to comprehend. The idea that a respected correctional officer could deliberately break the law seemed unthinkable, until it happened. Inside the jail, inmates and staff alike recognized her as someone who enforced rules firmly. She was not known for bending policy or showing favoritism. This image of strict professionalism made it easier for her actions to go unnoticed when she began making decisions that would later be questioned. Procedures that normally required verification were accepted without challenge because they came from someone seen as trustworthy. A system built on trust, authority, and routine, and a person who knew that system better than most. The shock of what followed did not come from violence or chaos inside the prison, but from the realization that power, when left unquestioned, can be quietly abused. This story does not begin with an escape or a crime scene. It begins with trust, and how easily it can be misused when no one thinks to look closer. The moment everything began to unravel came disguised as routine. On the morning of April 29, 2022, Vicky White arrived at work and informed colleagues that she would be transporting an inmate for a mental health evaluation. This type of transfer was not unusual, and because it came from a senior officer with years of experience, no one questioned it. There was no second escort assigned, no verification call made, and no additional approval requested. The system trusted her completely, and that trust would prove catastrophic. The inmate she escorted was already considered dangerous, facing serious charges. Yet White followed internal procedures just enough to avoid raising suspicion. Surveillance footage later showed her calmly walking the inmate out of the facility and into a patrol vehicle. There was no sign of distress, no resistance, no alarm. Within minutes, they were gone. When the transport vehicle was later found abandoned in a nearby parking lot, it became clear that this was not a mistake. It was an escape. Law enforcement agencies quickly launched a nationwide manhunt. Investigators began examining White's background, finances, and communications, uncovering a series of alarming details. She had recently sold her home, withdrawn large sums of money, and made purchases that suggested premeditation. These were not impulsive decisions. Evidence pointed to careful planning over an extended period, raising serious questions about how long the abuse of power had been unfolding without detection. As the investigation expanded, authorities revealed that White had used her insider knowledge to exploit weaknesses in jail operations. She understood staffing patterns, knew when supervision was minimal, and was familiar with transport protocols well enough to bypass safeguards. What shocked investigators most was how simple it had been. There were systems in place to prevent exactly this type of misconduct, but they relied heavily on trust, and trust had replaced verification. The public reaction was immediate and intense. News outlets across the country covered the story, focusing on how a correctional officer sworn to uphold the law had become an accomplice to a fugitive. Questions poured in. How could this happen? Why were procedures not followed? Who else knew or should have known? The case exposed uncomfortable truths about institutional oversight and the risks of granting unchecked authority to long-serving employees. The abuse of power did not require violence, threats, or force. It required access, experience, and the assumption that rules did not need to be enforced when the right person was involved. By the time those assumptions were challenged, the damage had already been done, and a trusted officer had crossed the line from authority to criminality. The final chapter of the case unfolded under the glare of national attention. As the manhunt intensified, federal and state authorities worked together to track Vicky White and the escaped inmate across state lines. Surveillance footage, license plate readers, financial transactions, and tips from the public slowly narrowed their movements. What began as a local escape investigation had transformed into a nationwide search, raising the stakes for law enforcement and the urgency for accountability. Investigators pieced together how deeply the plan had been calculated. Evidence showed that White had prepared well in advance, selling property, accumulating cash, and studying escape routes. Her actions revealed a complete collapse of professional boundaries and a deliberate decision to abandon her role as a corrections officer. Prosecutors later described the case as a clear example of insider corruption, someone entrusted with enforcing the law using that authority to break it. The pursuit ended after law enforcement located the pair and attempted to take them into custody. The conclusion was tragic, leaving unanswered questions about motivation, accountability, and mental state. While the criminal case against White could not proceed in court, investigations continued into institutional failures that allowed the escape to occur. Internal reviews identified breakdowns in supervision, lack of escort requirements, and over-reliance on senior staff without verification. The fallout extended far beyond one individual. Corrections departments across the country reassessed policies related to inmate transport, staff oversight, and internal reporting. Training procedures were revised, and new safeguards were introduced to ensure that no single employee could move high-risk inmates without checks and balances. The case became a cautionary example in law enforcement circles, demonstrating how corruption does not always come from external threats, but from within trusted systems. It was not just about an escape, but about the consequences of unchecked authority and the erosion of professional boundaries. The story forced the nation to confront an uncomfortable truth. When trust replaces accountability, the system becomes vulnerable. The prison guard who became a criminal did not exploit chaos. She exploited confidence. And that realization reshaped how correctional institutions across America view power, responsibility, and oversight.